Hey guys, Mr. Tweet here. So today I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about Thomas Hobbes. I know I had you guys watch a video on him yesterday, but sometimes Thomas Hobbes gets kind of a bum rap by social science teachers, historians, and especially by students who don't kind of understand the significance of what Thomas Hobbes was saying or what he did. Because the thing is that like when you take a class, usually like the one thing you learn about Thomas Hobbes is that he said that he got his famous quote from the Leviathan where he said life is nasty, brutish, and ultimately short. And so we talked about how like the state of nature was this like terrible thing, and that life would be so miserable in the state of nature where it's like constant war, conflict, that without government there, we would all be constantly fearing for our lives until that sad moment when somebody does actually show up and just crush us and kill us and take our families and our money and or whatever we've worked at and ruin our lives. And so for Hobbes, he basically said, look, state of nature was terrible. So as long as the government is protecting your life, like unlike what happens in the state of nature, you kind of like owe them your loyalty. Now, here's what's radical about that statement. Before Hobbes, the main belief about government was that like kings could do whatever they wanted. That like they were like basically they said, yeah, my authority as king is because God made one of my ancestors king and gave them the divine right to rule, and it's hereditary. So now I'm next in line and I get to do whatever I want to the people because God put me in charge. So basically, I'm like God. I can do whatever I want, and that's that. There is no like, second guessing me as the king. And Hobbes comes along and Hobbes is like, oh yeah, totally, for sure. Like, yeah, you're in charge. You get to run things, but this is key. You get to run things as long as like what you're providing for us is better than the state of nature. And that's the key idea, that Hobbes begins this idea that what makes a government legitimate is not the authority from God that puts them in power. What makes a government legitimate is that it protects you from the state of nature. Now, if a government protecting you from the state of nature makes it legitimate, the unspoken premise here, the assumption, is that if the government does not protect you from the state of nature, then it is not legitimate. And the idea of illegitimate government comes from Hobbes. So even though people tend to see him as like an apologist for dictators, as someone who said like, yeah, so what if the government takes away all your rights? In the state of nature, you wouldn't have any rights. In the state of nature, you would be miserable and you'd be fearful all the time. So if the government protects you from that, if they at least protect your life, then they're legitimate. It creates this idea that there's legitimate governments and illegitimate governments. And then if you believe that there are legitimate governments and illegitimate governments, it opens the door for the idea that if there is an illegitimate government, you are justified fighting back against that government. And that's the really radical idea of Thomas Hobbes, that if the government doesn't do what it's supposed to do, then we have the right to overthrow them. This idea begins with Hobbes, and it's known as social contract theory, that our relationship to government is not our relationship to God. That's what people believed all the way up to like Thomas Hobbes, at least in Western civilization. That, outside of maybe a time period in like ancient Greece or whatnot, for the most part, people believe that rulers ruled because God put them in charge. And so the relationship between man and government is the same as the relationship between man and God. And then Hobbes comes along and says, nope, the relationship between man and government is a contract, like any other contract. This is a social contract. It's a contract between society and the government, social society, right? There's a contract between society and the government, and anybody who knows anything about contracts knows if one side of the party, if one of the two sides of the contract doesn't uphold their side, the other side doesn't have to uphold theirs. So from this idea, we get what we call social contract philosophy. The idea that the relationship between people and their government is a contract, and if the government breaks the contract, the people don't have to be loyal to the government anymore. You can overthrow the government, you can revolt, you can have a revolution, you can kill the dictators, and you're justified. It's morally okay to have a revolution, as long as that contract is not being upheld. Now, Rousseau and Locke, they come along later and they have different ideas of what they think of that social contract. But it all begins with Hobbes, right? And if you believe in the idea of a social contract giving government its legitimacy, that means you also believe that there are times when the government is not legitimate because it's not upholding its social contract, which means that there are legitimate then opportunities for people to revolt and fight back against that government. So in your assignment today, you guys are going to be digging into this idea of, you're going to watch a video on the right to revolt. And then after that, you're going to be digging into the Declaration of Independence, which everybody loves for the beautiful language at the beginning. But really what the Declaration of Independence was, is it was a court case where the United States colonists were saying, here are our reasons for why we believe the King of England has broken the social contract, so we no longer have to uphold it. So I'm going to give you a couple assignments that go along with that. All right? So I'll see you in the videos where I explain the assignments. And there is also, you should have already seen that, there is a quick survey I had you do for the attendance for today. So anyways, yeah, see you on the assignment and have a good weekend.